My name is Amy Christensen, and I am CEO of Christensen Global Strategies, and I also have the pleasure of serving on the board of the International Center on Trade and Sustainable Development, where I also worked back in 1998. This is a very important panel. I think I actually am also the program chair of something called the World Climate Summit, which took place this weekend, and we had a lot of business leaders there talking about strategies to accelerate deployment of these technologies. And I have learned a great deal recently about the Sustainable Energy Trade Agreement idea, and it seems like a critically needed tool to remove barriers to these technologies to accelerate their deployment into new markets at the most efficient way possible. We have a lot of discussions in venues like the G20 about subsidies, and right now China and the United States are arguing about the role of their governments in supporting clean energy. And I think having a Sustainable Energy Trade Agreement in place is an interesting way for us to systematically address the barriers to deployment of these technologies in a more ordered way. So it'll be a very interesting conversation among our panelists here to talk about what this could look like, what is their perspective from the different industries and geographies where they're based, and how we might move forward on this concept where we could really help harness, as the title of the panel, harness the trade process to address climate change. So first, I will turn the presentations over to Ricardo Melendez-Ortiz, who you all know, who is the co-founder and executive director of the International Center on Trade and Sustainable Development, and who previously was the lead representative of Colombia in Geneva before the different institutions there, and has had a variety of leadership roles on trade and sustainable development for many years. Welcome, Ricardo.
So, good afternoon, and thank you very much, Amy. Thank you for that presentation. Thank you for being here, as well as all of you. I can't forget that I'm part of the organizers, so allow me to do that, and thank you for joining us at this session. I should also remark, for those of you that were not here yesterday, that we did have a full room yesterday. It doesn't mean that there's no interest today, but we're competing today with very, we understand, intensive discussions on trade at the main venue. In any case, we're very happy to be here, and we have an excellent panel. So thank you again, Amy. Very briefly, this is a very good opportunity to explain what we have in mind when we talk about a sustainable energy trade agreement or a sustainable energy trade initiative. What I'd like to do is give you sort of the context. What is it that we are reading in the current reality that we have with respect to energy, the prospects that we have for the future, and then the challenges that we have posed for ourselves. Namely, addressing climate change, providing access to energy that to those that don't have access to energy yet today in a modern form, and then obviously responding to concerns on energy security on a more global basis. So how do you move this? Oh, okay. Okay. So just I'm going to go very briefly on the context and then give you what we think could be a trade response to these concerns. So very, very briefly, you are all familiar with this. It just represents the very big challenge that we have ahead in terms of the reduction of CO2 emissions. And well, if you look there, the red curve shows sort of a business as usual scenario, while the green curve shows sort of the desirable scenario. This is where we need to go in terms of emissions towards 2035. The blue curve there shows you what could be what is called by the International Energy Agency a new policy scenario, and that would be the pathway that would follow if governments actually implement the pledges that they made back in Copenhagen and then in Cancun. So you see that even with those pledges, the gap remains extremely high. And with respect to access to energy, we know that we have about 1.4 to 1.6 a billion people, that's still a discussion, without, again, access to modern forms of energy around the world. That's going to change using current technologies in certain regions. It's going to get much more acute in Africa, as well as in certain parts of Asia. And that's, again, one of the challenges that we have. The General Assembly this year has decided that 2012 will be an international year of energy access for all, and that there would be targets established both on efficiency as well as more availability of energy. In terms of fossil fuels and the options that we have in place today, we know that oil and fossil fuels will continue to play a very big role towards the future, and indeed dependency on imports of fossil fuels will continue to increase all over the world as we move towards 2020 and 2030. Indeed, when we look at the scenarios that we have to respond, and this is on world energy demand, so to respond to the increasing demand, the very rapid and steep increase in demand of energy towards, again, 2050, what you find there is a very clear understanding of how much fossil fuels is going to constitute, and then the space that we have for the use of renewables. That gives you sort of a context of where we are. Now, against this backdrop, what we have seen in the past few years, and we'll probably hear more from colleagues in the panel about this, is a very important surge in new investment in renewable energies. So that's part of the good news that we have here. We're talking about a sector where there has been a very big response, mostly driven both by policy decisions as well as obviously market opportunities and very innovative financing that has been put in place to again respond to those challenges. Still, when we look at the needs ahead and the challenges, this is from the World Bank Development Report last year, we know that the question continues to be quite daunting. The World Bank estimates that in order to reach the kind of required capacity on renewable energy, we will need to deploy this huge additional capacity in the wind turbines and power plants, CSP type, as well as photovoltaic panels, which makes, again, the challenge very steep. Now, so where does trade come into all this? So as I said before, there are a number of policies that have been put in place that have resulted in these new situations that we have in the renewable energy markets, but they're not sufficient. And they're not sufficient with respect to the innovation that we're seeing. Renewable energy technologies that are available continue to be uncompetitive with respect to fossil fuel alternatives. Now, this is for many reasons, not least because fossil fuels don't incorporate the cost of carbon, but also they get additional help from subsidies from governments, both in the consumption and the production end. And then we should also be honest about that. Well, the technologies that we have are probably, they could be improved in terms of their efficiency. So we need to scale up innovation, we need to scale up production, and we need to scale up use of those technologies. This is just very quickly to give you an idea of how, from a jobs perspective, renewable energies are also clearly sectors or if you like, technologies that provide better opportunities unemployment than fossil fuels. Let me not get lost in this presentation and just very quickly move into the policy for renewable energies and how they relate to trade. So the first thing is that in a deeply integrated world with very heterogeneous endowments with respect to energy sources as well as capabilities to produce technologies, we have now value chains that are more and more important. This is just a quick illustration of how in the US, for instance, in the wind energy sector, the share of imported blades specifically has been shifting and becoming more and more important. But more interesting here, which is what I wanted to show in this graph, is the composition of those imports. So you see the kind of opportunities that these sectors are generating for developing countries. You see now Mexico and China and a number of developing countries appearing in the picture and moving with more and more relevance as we go from 2005 and 2010, so just in a few years. That's very similar in the case of wind power generating sets, where, again, India, for instance, becomes a very important supplier. In the case of towers and masts, we have now countries like Vietnam that are very important in the U.S. market. And again, that's just to give you an idea of how trade then becomes, in any sector, but particularly in renewable energies, an engine of growth, of opportunities for everybody in an integrated global economy. Now, there are a number of barriers that are used by governments as they design policy to promote renewable energies and the use of renewable energies at the domestic level, and they try to respond particularly to competing claims on the policy objectives. So are they promoting renewable energies because they want to promote changes in the energy mix, a shift to a lower carbon economy, or because they want to promote industry or innovation or jobs in their own country? Now, a number of those policies that countries use would have effects on prices and on efficiency all across the supply chain in such a way that they would make, again, the challenge to scale up much, much more difficult. And so what we'd like to do is to try to, again, make sure that we can address those inefficiencies. This, again, is from research that we have been doing the past few years, where we have mapped the production of components of renewable energy goods and services. And we have done it in a quite disaggregated manner, going to 6, 8, and 10 digits in the tariff code. And we have found then that there's a big relevance for a number of countries, again, to participate in these markets. That goes, again, against sort of the common perception that these technologies and the participation in the markets at the global level in these technologies is something that is limited to only a number of countries, particularly OECD countries. We have also done a mapping of trade barriers and drivers and investment drivers as well. And some of the mapping that we've done tells us what's the situation with respect to, again, for instance, tariffs. So what you see illustrated there, it's tariffs as they are applied by a number of countries, both developed and developing countries, to a number of these technologies as well as final goods related to climate, both energy and other type of goods. And you see the kind of landscape that we have, a very heterogeneous landscape that, again, if flattened, would probably generate more efficiencies in that market. In the current, with respect to current frameworks that we have to deal with that situation, well, the most important one is the WTO, and the WTO has been, in the context of the Doha round of negotiations, has been discussing environmental goods and services, specifically the question of market access on goods and services. But there are a number of other trade measures, as I said before, including local content requirements, subsidies, a number of issues related to standards, to the provision of services, export restrictions and taxes, tax credits, and so on, that are also important to address, that it's also important to address. And doing analysis of what we have in the WTO currently, with the understanding that we have of the multilateral trade system and global governance systems, where we depart from the notion that all these systems are evolutionary and should be to adapt to the needs as they arise, we find that there are a number of governance gaps and ambiguities that need clarification in those agreements. So what we're saying is that the multilateral trade system is well equipped to deal with a number of these issues, but it may require to either go through interpretation of some ambiguities in some of them, of its provisions, and that happens in that system through the use of dispute settlement. It is currently the case in renewable energies, already in a number of areas, or it can do so through negotiations. Now, in the absence of an effort to move fast in generating the kind of trade frameworks that we required for the scale-up of this use of these technologies, the question is, what is alternative? And so what we have proposed, we call it a sustainable trade, energy trade agreement that has its own history, but it's also, in a way, a provocative way of telling governments, here you can do something that can get us moving. It is an initiative that you can look at in many different ways. So it could be actually an energy agreement with trade provisions. It could be an environmental agreement with trade-specific obligations. It could be a trade agreement of a plurilateral type. And if it's a trade agreement with a plurilateral type, it could be hosted under the aegis of the WTO. And there are different forms in which we can do that. Either there's a model that we call the Information Technologies Agreement type, which allows for the extension of benefits to all WTO members in an MFN basis. But there's another model, more difficult probably politically to get to, which we call the Government Procurement Agreement type, that would require a particular waiver and would not make all benefits available to all members, but rather to only the members of that plurilateral agreement. It could also be that governments decide to set up an agreement which stands alone at the plurilateral level. A few governments get together, as they did with the Montreal Protocol, or with CITES, or with a number of other issues, including more recently with trade-specific concerns, and set up a plurilateral agreement among governments that are willing to move forward in strengthening markets by eliminating these inefficiencies. It may also be that governments decide to put together something that some of my colleagues has described as a plug and play or a toolkit, where you define what are the components, what are the goods that you're talking about, the services that you're talking about, what are the kind of measures that you want to address, and then you use it either bilaterally or, say, in the context of the trilateral talks that African countries are having to bring together a common market among 3 of the major plurilateral trade agreements in the region, say, or you bring it to APEC and the decision that was just made a few weeks ago for APEC countries to accelerate the liberalization of this type of goods, or any other form. And so you just put it together. So what we're proposing here is not a rigid idea of a plurilateral trade agreement. I understand, I was not here yesterday, that someone made some remarks on some of the work that we have done around this issue with the Peterson Institute of International Affairs without misunderstanding of what we're really proposing. So what we're proposing really is that in the face of immediate action, notwithstanding that we have a sector where investment has been growing in a very interesting way, where there is a proliferation of measures that governments are taking at the domestic level, but where the pace and the dimension, the scale of the response is insufficient to address the challenges, that we do something. That's what we're proposing. And then we're laying out the options that we have out there to do something. We have distributed, so I won't go into the details in the room and outside, some literature that we have put together, some analysis, so that people get more familiar with the type of technicalities around this idea, and that we can discuss it more in detail. Politically speaking, we launched this idea in the first Global Green Growth Forum, convened by the government of Denmark and together with the governments of Korea, Mexico, and with the participation of a number of other governments, including heads of the state of Ethiopia and Africa. And it got support as an initiative, which has given us some enthusiasm to move forward. Next week, we are having a meeting of ministers of trade in Geneva along the ministerial conference of the WTO, where we would continue to discuss all the options that are out there, now responding to the decisions that ministers will likely make next week to explore new approaches for action, again, in trade policy. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ricardo. Next, we have Balawan Joshi, who is Director and Managing Partner at ABPS, Infrastructure Advisory Private Limited, and he has more than 15 years' experience in the energy and utilities sector in India across the entire value chain. He has advised over 20 states in India on regulatory frameworks on these issues, and he started his career at Tata Electric Companies, was also with Deloitte Touche Tohmatsu, and he has been involved in the drafting of the proposed renewable energy law of India, and most recently has been advised by the Bureau of, has been appointed by the Bureau of Energy Efficiency of the Government of India as a country expert for the demand-side management program for the International Energy Agency. So we are in good hands.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you very much. My fellow speakers on the dais, ladies and gentlemen. When I first, received the invitation from Mahesh to speak on particular topic, and I read the paper, I found the idea very, very interesting. I started thinking about it, how it would actually apply to India. I started working on the presentation, what I should be giving over here. And then I thought, let me do it other way around. Let me try and present Indian case study before this audience. And let me leave it to the audience and experts over here to decide what is sustainable from the country's point of view, whether the policies adopted by a particular country are sustainable, what these policies would lead to. There are some stories in this particular presentation which I will try to present. So, the presentation has got actually 3 themes. One is the renewable energy development in India, wind success story, and the emerging solar story. Why I have kept the renewable energy development in India? I think there is a lot of, I have noticed that there is a lot of misconception about India's renewable energy program. Well, a lot of people would have heard about the solar mission. What exactly India has done in terms of renewable energy is not many people know about. So I thought, let me put it. Most of us would know that India is a very big country. We have got several technologies, several resources. Primarily wind, solar, small hydro, these are the big resources in the country. And they are located in the different parts of the country. If you look at wind, it's located in 6 states. 4 southern states and 2 western states, Maharashtra and Gujarat, and the 4 southern states. Look at solar, it's a northwestern part of the country, Rajasthan, part of the Gujarat, part of Maharashtra. If you look at small hydro, it's located in the Himalayas and it's located into Karnataka and Maharashtra. And we have a challenge in terms of moving this energy from one state to another state. And this is also one of the part of the SETA. One is the component of the trade in terms of the manufacturing, and the second is component of the energy. How do you really move energy, sustainable energy from one area to another area? I'm not going to talk about the renewable energy certificate mechanism which we specifically developed to address this second challenge, to move renewable energy from one part of the country to another part of the country. But that's essentially how we address this particular issue. We have a very thriving market in renewable energy certificates, and we were associated with design of that. But that's how we essentially looked at the cross-state renewable energy movement. One would ask question, why one really need to look at India is one country, so why the issue is so important? Yes, India is one country, but India is a federal country. And electricity is within the concurrent list, what we call it. So the state as well as the central has got authority to have law on the matters related to the electricity. Distribution of electricity, renewable sources related to electricity, procurement of renewable by the states is a matter of the state law. So strictly speaking, unless and until the states agree to transfer energy from one state to another state as a renewable energy, you cannot do it. And that's precisely the reason we had developed and implemented the renewable energy certificate mechanism. Moving on to the renewable energy development in the country. We have got around 21,000 megawatt of renewable energy, which is around 12% of the total generating capacity. In terms of energy, it is somewhere around 5.5%. One important thing which I think most people don't know is that when we talk about renewable energy, we don't take into account large hydro projects, whether it's run of the river or whether it's a storage type. Forget about the debate whether the large hydro, which is a storage type, it is a carbon neutral or not, but certainly it's a renewable. But we don't take into account large hydro into our renewable calculation. There are historical reasons for that. I'm not going to get into it, but that capacity itself is more than 38,000 megawatt in the country. And add to that 21,000 megawatt of the other renewable, new renewable capacity, it takes it to close to 60,000 megawatt of renewable energy capacity. 1/3 the total generating capacity of the country, and 1/5 of the in terms of energy. So it's not something like that India is not doing anything about renewable energy. In fact, we are one of the largest producers of renewable energy as a percentage terms in the world, with close to 20% of the renewable generation, with close to 1/3 of the capacity. But we have got a huge potential. If you look at even the conventional methodologies used to estimate the potential, we have got huge potential. Wind, we have got close to 50,000 megawatt potential. If you look at solar, again 50,000 megawatt potential. These are very, very conservative estimates. If you look at biomass, again 20,000 megawatt potential. So there is no doubt that we need to adopt the policies which would enable sustainable development of these resources. In order to give impetus to the sustainable development of the renewable energy resources, the Government of India, our Honorable Prime Minister, announced the National Action Plan on Climate Change in 2008, before Copenhagen. It consists of several missions which look at both mitigation as well as adaptation. And both the missions, all the missions, 8 missions, are bound to have some component of energy here and there. Like even talk about a green mission or even talk about sustainable habitat mission. But the 2 missions which are very important from the sustainable energy perspective, and those are National Solar Mission and a National Mission on Enhanced Energy Efficiency. These are the first top 2 missions I have mentioned. These missions are expected to run through 2017 up to 2022. And expected to produce, all the missions have got specific targets. I will come about and talk about the targets in the solar mission over here, and not, but all other missions also have got a specific targets. The other missions deal with Himalayan ecosystems, green mission, that is essentially forestry related mission. We have got a sustainable habitat, that's a building energy efficiency related mission, water mission, knowledge management systems, and sustainable agriculture. How does it matter in terms of the renewable and sustainable energy? The NAPCC has set the target for the country of 5% of renewable energy in 2009-2010, and which we have achieved. And that excludes large hydro, increasing by 1% each year to reach 15% by 2020. If you look at the NAPCC target of 15% by 2020, and if we look at the projections carried out by the Government of India for the energy requirement in 2020, it's around 1,700 billion units. And 15% of that would mean 255 billion units of opportunity for renewable energy. It's not going to be easy, especially because how much of the capacity one needs to add to achieve this kind of a renewable energy generation? By modest calculation, at least 7,000 megawatt of the capacity has to be added every year, as against 3,500 megawatt we achieved last year. We have set the target for the next 5-year period, which is more than 5,000 megawatt per year. Having come to that, let me talk about some policy framework which government has implemented. And actually, if you try to map this framework against the chart which was presented by Ricardo in his slides, you will find probably all the instruments which are mentioned over there have been used by India in some context or other. Way back in 93-94, the government implemented the feed-in tariff mechanism, first feed-in tariff mechanism. Moving onwards to the renewable purchase obligations, accelerated depreciation, essentially the depreciation benefit, production tax credit in the form of generation-based incentive, renewable energy certificate for the interstate trade of electricity, trade of renewable energy, renewable purchase obligations in terms of quota obligations, in terms of the competitive bidding. So all the policy instruments which are usually talked about, India has used in some form or other, including sales tax benefit, customs duty benefit. What this has achieved in terms of the market, we have seen in terms of the capacity that there has been significant addition, 21,000 megawatt. But in terms of market, what it has been able to achieve. I have divided these RE policies into 3 sets, and just to demonstrate that we have used practically every policy which is available to our disposal in the country. Let's look at the 2 dominant sources, wind and solar. Wind forms nearly more than 60% of the total renewable energy capacity in the country. Out of 21,000 megawatt in the country, 15,000 megawatt capacity is the wind capacity. And in terms of ranking in the world, India ranks 5th largest in terms of the wind energy installed capacity. India has also developed a very strong manufacturing base for the wind energy. We have more than 10 manufacturers with aggregate capacity of 7,000 megawatt of manufacturing capacity. The country has also achieved close to 80% indigenization. More or less all atoms are produced within the country. The 5 largest manufacturers, Suzlon, which is an Indian company, Enercon, Gamesa, Vestas, Regen Power, actually have close to 90% of the market. A lot of these companies are new companies which have entered the market in last 3 years, last 4 years, and they are quickly gaining the market share. In fact, if you see the year-on-year market share, the dominant 3 players, that's Suzlon, Enercon, and Gamesa put together, has been reducing. Suzlon, which used to be close to more than 60% around 3 years back, has got reduced to less than 50%, 45, 47% today. So the competition is thriving, a lot of indigenous manufacturing capacity, and as a result, also there has been pressure on the tariffs. However, pressure on the tariff has been probably more significant in the case of solar. Why and how I will come to now. I mentioned about the National Solar Mission the government has announced. It has set very ambitious targets. It talks about increased grid capacity through mandatory use of RPO and favorable generation-based incentive. The government has set aside a separate RPO for the solar, which is supposed to increase from 0.25% in the first year to 3% in the 2020. It has also set the physical targets. And in terms of the physical targets, I'm going to talk about the 2022 targets. That is a 20 million meter square of panel area for the off-grid applications. In terms of the off-grid generation, 2,000 megawatt, and the on-grid generation of 20,000 megawatt. But also Solar Mission talks about increasing the manufacturing capacity within the country, have the very strong manufacturing base and R&D base. Within the phase 1, there were 2 competitive bids which were held. What we call it as a batch 1 and batch 2. If you see at the top, it's mentioned as a batch 1 of the phase 1, which was carried out in November 2010. A very unique process was adopted to determine the tariffs, and that was the reverse auction. So the regulator had set the tariff for a kind of a feed-in tariff, and all the developers were asked to submit the bids as discount to the benchmark tariff. And you will see the results are very, very interesting. In the first phase, solar PV, 150 megawatt was awarded, and solar thermal, 470 megawatt was awarded. I have given the tariffs in the cents per kilowatt hour. The benchmark tariff determined by the regulator was 38.93 cents per kilowatt hour, while the minimum tariff bid which was received was at 23.80 cents. And the maximum bid which was accepted in 150 megawatt was at 27.74 cents per kilowatt hour. In the case of solar thermal, it was 22.80 and 26.61. And you will see the kind of a discount which was offered by the various manufacturers is significant. Average discount for the solar PV was at 12 cents, 12.5 cents, while the average discount offered for the solar thermal was 8.5 cents. And that was possible because of the competition. Out of these projects, already 143 megawatt of capacity has been commissioned till November 24. And it's expected that entire 150 megawatt capacity from the solar, from the batch 1, and another 100 megawatt capacity from some other schemes would get commissioned in the next 3 to 4 months. What is interesting is that the kind of bids which were received by the government. If you look at, for the 150 megawatt and 470 megawatt thermal, the bids were received with more than 3,400 megawatt, 1,505 megawatt SPV, and 2,900 megawatt of thermal. Next thing, phase 2 bidding. It was even more interesting. Phase 2 bidding took place only for solar PV. It was completed just few days back. The results have been announced after I reached Durban, so it's that recent. The LOIs are yet to be issued, but the results are very interesting. The minimum bid, which was there in earlier phase 1, batch 1, 2380 has gone down to 1440 cents. Probably the lowest level of the solar tariffs discovered anywhere in the world. 1440, it's close to 7.5 rupees. Close to lower than the, or I would say it's not close to, it's the lower than the marginal power purchase cost for many of the utilities. So in some way, it's kind of achieving the grid parity. Maximum bid of 18 cents, weighted average is 16, 17 cents, while the discount offered is close to 13 cents. It's a huge discount. And again, the projects, the number of bids were not small. While the 26 projects were 345 megawatt has been selected, the bids were received were 183 bids with the total capacity of 2,180 megawatt. Massive. While doing this, what were the conditions? I think that's very important. We talk about trade barriers, we talk about the other barriers in the case of, but what were the basic requirements under this particular type of bidding in the phase 1 as well as the batch 1 as well as the batch 2? But before that, what is the kind of the solar manufacturing capacity which exists in the country? If you look at 2010-2011, the last column, 750 megawatt of cell manufacturing capacity and 1,250 megawatt of the panel manufacturing capacity. There are a large number of players which are still interested to come into the market and trying to set up the base. Which are the lead manufacturers? Mozabar, Indosolar, Tata BP Solar, Web Solar, Lanco Solar, Titan. Most of these are Indian players. They have brought in technology and they have set up the manufacturing capacity. There is also an intention and a move to do the backward integration and have polysilicon plant of 1,250 million ton, along with the 80 megawatt peak wafering facility. Coming back to the issue of what were the bidding requirements. Phase 1, batch 1, if you see, 2010, the one which we saw the first bid. The SPV, the requirement was modules must be manufactured in India. Solar thermal, at least 30% content by value. PV modules from the thin film could have been manufactured, or concentrated PV could have been manufactured anywhere in the world. As far as the 2011 is concerned, for SPV, the requirement became a little stronger because both cells and modules are required to be manufactured in India. No such requirement on the thin film, and there was no thermal bidding over here. But what is interesting, this is not the only scheme which is operating in India. Every state has got its own scheme because it's a state level thing. So there are Gujarat, Rajasthan and Karnataka state level projects which are being implemented and for which there is no domestic content requirement. So the large number of these projects they are coming up using different types of technologies. So the final slide. We have been able to achieve significant amount of renewable energy capacity addition in the recent past. While achieving capacity addition, the government has, for good or bad, has put in domestic content requirement, and which has, at least on the face of it, has helped domestic manufacturing industry. JNNSM is going to open or is actually opening a significant market. While we talk about 20,000 megawatt, I suspect at the end of 2022, we would have probably far more capacity than 22,000 megawatt. But while doing that, India will have to maintain a very fine balance between both the policies for the domestic manufacturing as well as for the increasing the capacity, generating capacity at a fast pace. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's incredible that you all have basically gotten to grid parity in this last bidding process. And thank you for that context and the interesting discussion I'm sure we'll have about domestic content requirements. So Peter Brun is next, and he is the Senior Vice President at Vestas Wind Systems, heading group government relations and having worked with public and regulatory affairs his entire career. He leads Vestas' global dialogue with energy policy stakeholders, including serving as Vice President of the European Wind Energy Association and as Vestas' permanent representative in the IEA, the World Economic Forum, the G20 Business Summit, and other global climate and energy venues. Thank you, Peter.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Amy, for the introduction. I'm extremely pleased to be here to talk about why global markets matter for an international player like Vestas. You might know that our company is one of the pioneers in the industry over the last 30 years. We are still a leader in the industry. We have been selling the technology in 67 countries around the world and put out 25% of all global wind power capacity. The reality today is that Vestas is only having a local market of 0.01%, meaning that our market, our sales is 99.9% export. So our company is indeed very much dependent about being able to play in the global market. And I hope in this presentation here I will give you some very strong argument why this is necessary going forward also. Certainly, I think it's fair to say that this industry has worked well over the last 30 years. We have been developing the industry little by little. We have been moving under the radar, as I like to say it. We have been regarded as a component manufacturing industry, but in recent years, it's fair to say that this industry is being regarded more and more as a strategic industry for good and worse. It's good because it gets a lot of attention, but certainly it's bad because we're seeing some tendencies that we have seen in other protected industries coming into or playing into this industry here, and that is of a great worry, I think, from many points of views. The first of it is certainly that we are in a situation now where we would like to see this technology disseminated all over the world in all markets at the lowest possible cost. We certainly also want this technology to be able to increase and scale up, and by that also deliver a lot of green jobs in the future. But if one is taking the wrong direction on this, I can tell you that the three things that I'm highlighting in this slide, boosting green jobs, mitigating climate change, and reducing cost of energy, will not be a reality. And that's the reason why we need to discuss these things here very carefully on the pros and the cons on this. As Ricardo already said in his presentation, the industry is already regulated. It has a lot of tariffs around it. It is not really very different from many other industry components. But in some markets, certainly, we do see quite elevated industry tariffs. But that's not the worst thing, really. I think the worst thing that we are seeing increasingly, especially in new markets or emerging markets, is the spread of all the non-tariff barriers. And they're simply coming up quite casually, if I can put it that way, as a growth strategy in emerging markets, which not in all cases is sustainable. My Indian friend alluded to what is sustainable energy, and I think that is worth having a good discussion about that. In our view, sustainable energy is certainly that we let this technology grow as rapidly as possible, as we have seen in the IT sector over the last decades. And that is really the ambition and aspiration that we would like to see for this new technologies, not only wind power, but certainly all the other green technologies also. So I think there are many strong arguments for trying to learn from all the good experiences we have had in IT and maybe take them over to this technology also. It is very ironic in many ways that the focus from governments have been so much on putting in NTBs or local content requirements, because it is in the nature, at least for the wind industry, an industry and an investment that will localize to a great degree. In our view, there's simply too much emphasis on the single blade factory employing 300, 400, and 500 people normally, but not necessarily much more. And there's a disregard on all the other jobs in the value chain that, as I tried to scale up here, or to make clear here, the whole market development, preparation of it, the transportation, the build of plants, the maintenance jobs, and the maintenance and operation jobs will be permanent local jobs for 20 years in the lifetime of the technology. And I don't think, I mean, I'm an industry player, I don't think we get that recognition here sufficiently, that this is actually a technology that will bring back the cash flow again to a very great extent, much more than any other investments in fossil fuel technologies. Why? Well, for the simple reason that we are not based on imported fuels. So you get a lot of payback here again in the lifetime, in the full investment period here. So that is also a sustainability, I think, consideration to be quite clear about. I think the list of the cons, the reasons for why local content requirement is not a good thing is long. And I have been trying to highlight here a few clear arguments why this is not a sustainable thing. First and foremost, it limits competition. It increases the cost of the investment. It gives a lot of challenges in terms of sometimes how to organize your supply chain. It hinders, not least, introduction of new technology platforms. It can bring situations of overcapacity in the market because, as we have seen in China, this industrial approach can make an artificial, stimulated market with arbitrary effects. And then it certainly is adding also a lot of project risk in I would say, in developing countries. And as we all know, I mean, working in developing countries is sometimes also very challenging. And here we simply need to face the reality. 3-4 years ago, we did not have a lot of investments of wind power plants in emerging markets. In this country, South Africa here, there's only a very limited installation of wind power. My company has been one of the first ones here installing 3 or 4 turbines, but that is what it is. They are now changing gear, and I will come back to that in a moment, but that is a reality. And 3-4 years ago, before the financial crisis, this sector was fully occupied in supplying the mature markets and not the developing countries. And certainly, lastly but not least, it has a cost impact to the consumers. And this is an issue which in the industry feels very obliged to highlight, because we are regarded in many markets as a costly technology. This is always the argument: why do you need the subsidies? Why have you needed it for 30 years? Will you ever get out of the subsidies? When will you be grid parity level? When can you compete without the subsidies? So there's a very, very strong wish, I would say, in this industry to go and deliver what the market wants and what the consumer wants and expects from us. And that is, within the next years, to deliver what we call grid parity technology, meaning that we can compete in normal market conditions without the subsidy, with gas turbines, with coal, with nuclear. And I don't think personally that we're very far away, but certainly in many markets it can go the other way, and it can slow down that process of efficiency. Another thing I also want to highlight, and that needs to come in as a very practical point of view in this discussion, is that the basic business model is localizing. And a player like Vestas have been doing this for years. As I said, it is part of our basic business plan and offering to the local market. And it has a lot to do about especially knowledge transfer and skills transfer. We have done it in Europe, we have done it in China 10 years ago. Just look what China has become now. We have done it in India. I didn't, unfortunately, not put on India, but as a matter of fact, my company has been out there for many years. We started as a joint venture with IB Vestas. Now it's called IB Energy, I think. Yeah, and certainly we have done a lot of knowledge transfer also in India. And we continue that approach also in emerging markets in Brazil and here in South Africa, in many other markets. So it's part of the basic business model simply. It's not only about, providing the technology. It's not a supply only thing, this. Normally this is especially when it goes bigger, it's a systemic approach, a system approach that needs to come in. It's about how to handle the grid, how to deal with how it fits into the energy system. And that's a broader, skills transfer that is needed for this. Of course, we're very pleased to see that these things might be taken up, in multilateral negotiations or even in other ways. And we certainly would have liked to see that the Doha round would be finalized very shortly. Fortunately, we are also seeing clear signals that might not be the case. And therefore we need to consider other means of getting that clarity also on the trade side. And certainly CETA, in whatever form it could be, could serve some innovation, I think, in this discussion. And certainly we would be very supportive of this. We certainly would see a plurilateral agreement as just a means for getting to what we want at the multilateral level. So it's a vehicle, and that needs to be discussed. What would be the most efficient vehicle for this? Certainly these areas are also pursued already in local or regional FTAs, and that is a kind of a slower vehicle, but it's also something that is used and encouraged from industry. So we're very hopeful that there would be some very strong arguments behind opting into this. I hope I have been coming around some of the examples why local content NTBs might not be the most effective way of getting that technology. Here in South Africa, there's a lot of emphasis on localization. In the present tender, the requirement is about 30%. Personally, I think, or we don't think that's a problem, because as I said, the nature of doing wind plants will at least deliver 30%. You cannot do it otherwise. But of course, there need to be some considerations if markets and countries want to go beyond. And I also think it's fair to say what works for China, what worked for China, what worked for India might not necessarily apply to any other market. This is about also the scale of the market. And ironically, in all these discussions, when we discuss with our friends in Brazil, when we discuss with our friends in South Africa, they're all pointing to the times where there will be the hub of local expert in the region. And that is ironic, because what is the attitude next door then? Do they also want a localization? Do they also want the NTBs to come in? I think yes, they would, if that is the approach of the larger players in the region. So it's a very short-sighted, strategy here. And it disregards, as I said, all the potential, for example, that this country here could play in terms of also being a supplier for the local supply chain. South Africa has an industry base which is interesting, just on its own terms. And if this industry base could go in and look at the opportunity side on all the components that are in a turbine, they might find some global opportunities here that would be reaching out of just the local market. And again here, it's about sustainability. If I understand the South African game plan correctly, we're talking about a yearly market of 400 megawatt per year. How sustainable do you think that is to have 1, 2, 3, 4 local manufacturers coming in? I don't think so. So let's call the reality in the discussion on this, because it is about sustainability, and for us it's also to give the advice of not throwing out public money in a flawed strategy that not deliver what you really want here. And again, it's about the policy stability. That is the strong driver of getting these investments in. And here I think government has a big role to play. But they can also take the wrong direction. So we are very pleased to have this discussion here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Peter. Thanks very much. Our next speaker is Carlos Cavalcanti, who is Director of the Infrastructure Department of the Federation of Industries of the State of Sao Paulo. He is Vice President of the organization's Foreign Trade Council as well, and he is a member of the Decision-Making Committee of the National Industrial Training Service. He is also currently a member of the Energy Policy Committee of the Government of the State of Sao Paulo, as well as playing leadership roles in associations in the marble and granite and related industries. So thank you very much for joining us.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction. Before I begin, I'd like to talk a moment to recognize my colleagues joining me on stage, Mr. Schock, Mr. Brun, Ms. Christensen, Mr. Ortiz, and Mr. Joshi. I'd like to thank the ICTSD for the invitation to this event. Today, I hope to send out the message that Brazil is continuing to go through large leaps in social and economic development and has been an example of success in significant poverty reduction through investment in large-scale renewable energy. My presentation will go through the 3 main elements that are important for Brazil and our national interests in any sustainable energy trade agreement. It must promote social inclusion and technologies that are both low-carbon technologies and cost-effective. I will then go over some of the current trade barriers Brazil is facing, while pointing out fundamental features such an agreement would need. What elements would be in a sustainable energy trade agreements? One thing for sure is that the 3 pillars of sustainable development should be the backbone of any trade agreement on sustainable energy, being social, environmental, and economic pillars. The first element that is often overlooked is the social pillar. In any sustainable energy trade agreement, reducing poverty should be fundamental. But what is the link between an energy trade agreement and poverty? And the answer, in my opinion, is energy poverty. Today, around 1.5 billion people worldwide do not have access to electricity, and 3 billion people rely on primary biomass for cooking and heating. Indoor air pollution from this primary biomass combustion in open cooking stoves is a leading cause for adult, infant, and child mortality in developing countries, ahead of malaria and tuberculosis combined. These findings have major policy implications for developing countries that aim to achieve the Millennium Development Goals while growing their economies. There's a close correlation between economic growth and poverty reduction that is well illustrated by the recent experience of countries like China, Brazil, India, and South Africa, which have experienced sustainable economic growth and significant poverty reduction in recent years. One important pathway, the one we are going to present today, is through energy access. Investing in infrastructure is undisputedly the first step for country to substantially reduce poverty. The slide maps out the regions in the world most suffering from this energy poverty, showing the percentage of people using solid fuel within the home, which is the most hazardous and inefficient fuel one could use. Please take note that almost all of sub-Saharan and most of Asia are in need of energy. This distribution will be important later on in this presentation, so take note of these two regions. Brazil has struggled to overcome lower electricity rates in some regions of the country since 1991. These low access rates also had a strong effect on economic and social development in the same regions. The 2003 program, Light for All, had the goal of reaching out to the estimated 10 million people in rural areas that lacked electricity. Brazil did this first through major grid extension projects, financing existing projects that were stalled due to low funding, and through decentralized generation systems for isolated communities. By 2009, the goal was reached, and those 10 million people got access to electricity. The result of the program affected all socioeconomic areas. School attendance at night classes increased by 40%, employment rates went up 34%, income rates increased 35%, and access to health care services grew 22%. With increasing energy access, these areas experienced increasing economic development. Looking at the Millennium Development Goal number 1, eradicating extreme levels of poverty, the graph here shows the decrease in extreme poverty in Brazil during this time. By 2009, the population living on less than $1 per day was decreased by 66% from the 1999 level. Not surprisingly, the human development in Brazil during the implementation of this program also increased. This is Brazil's electricity network today. Brazil could not have progressed in human development and energy access without a well-integrated power system centered on hydropower. Not only do these hydro centers provide clean, affordable source of energy throughout the entire country, but they are equally important in the integration of South America too. These projects are changing development within Latin America, and is the trend that will continue until ultimately the entire continent is interconnected. This model of power integration centered on large hydropower is just starting to be applied in Africa. And it is a fundamental first step towards alleviating energy poverty on the continent. This point on large hydropower brings me to the next pillar, to a sustainable energy trade agreement that promotes low-carbon technologies. Sustainable energy must include all technologies that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but not each renewable energy source is treated the same. The slide summarizes the average greenhouse gas emissions from different power plants worldwide throughout their lifetime. Large hydropower is the technology with the lowest carbon emissions over its life cycle. After large hydropower, small hydropower comes in second place. from the plant with the lowest impact on climate. Another important energy seen here is bioenergy. Though not the lowest emitter, it is an important resource that is often readily available in developing countries from agricultural waste. These have been important resources to Brazil. Remember the map showing energy poverty worldwide from earlier? Let's compare those energy poor regions again with their hydropower potential. This potential are shown above, with Asia obviously standing out with the most. It has 55% of the world's total potential at more than 2,000 gigawatts. But let's focus a moment on Africa. The IPCC estimates that Africa has a potential of 283 gigawatts. This seems quite modest compared to Asia, but what does 283 gigawatt exactly mean to Africa? This graph shows that this potential is to Africa. The green bar on the left is Africa's current installed capacity, 117 gigawatts. This power is mostly concentrated in just a few countries, whereas most of sub-Saharan Africa contribute little to this capacity. The bar on the right-hand side represents the renewable energy potential on the continent in wind, geothermal, and hydropower. 283 gigawatt of power can more than double its current power capacity. Also, this hydro potential is mostly found in the very energy-poor Central and Eastern Africa, in areas most needed. Other renewables can play a supporting role to Africa's power sector, but it is hydropower that will change the face of poverty. Today, over 82% of Brazil's power comes from mainly large hydropower. Brazil is currently utilizing just 30% of its total hydropower potential, with 175 gigawatts of untapped hydropower. The graph shows 5% of the power supply comes from high-efficiency cogeneration power plants throughout the ethanol and sugar industry. In 2008, there were 456 ethanol facilities that were 100% power self-sufficient and selling electricity surplus to the power grid. There's a widespread misconception about hydropower, in which small hydropower has a lower impact than a larger one. There is a misconception that large hydropower is not sustainable. Today, I'm here to give my opinion to try to clarify this. But to clarify this misconception, I will not use my words. I use the words of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change itself, the IPCC, on the matter of large and small hydropower. So, from its 2011 special report on renewable energy sources and climate change mitigation, the IPCC made the following remarks in Chapter 5, dedicated to hydropower, quoting, "Classification according to size, while both common and administratively simple, is to a degree arbitrary. Concepts like small or large hydro are not technically or scientifically rigorous indicators of impacts, economics, or characteristics. Hydropower projects cover a continuum in scale, and it may ultimately be more useful to evaluate hydropower projects based on their sustainability or economic performance, thus setting out more realistic indicators. Moreover, on large-scale hydropower projects of 2,000 megawatts located in a remote area of one river basin might have fewer negative impacts than the cumulative impacts of 400 plants of 5 megawatts in many river basins. Page 5. Continuing quoting. For that reason, even the cumulative relative environmental and social impacts of large versus small hydropower development remain unclear and context dependent. Hydropower projects over a continuum in scale, and it may ultimately be more useful to evaluate hydropower projects based on their sustainability or economic performance, thus setting out more realistic indicators. End of quote. Today, 32% of Brazil's total energy supply comes from biomass sources. An important point to make here is that the biomass used in Brazil is mainly from ethanol from sugarcane, rather than from burning primary biomass like the rest of the world is mostly using. Brazil has been successful in integrating biofuels at the large scale into its economy. Keeping low carbon in mind, not ethanol should be treated equally. Each feedstock has a different impact on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This impact depends on the energy content in the feedstock, crop yields, production processes, to name a few. The graph shows the variation in reducing greenhouse gas emissions depending on location and process used, with some actually increasing greenhouse gas emissions rather than decreasing them. Ethanol from sugarcane comes out as the most important ethanol in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and also the feedstock with the least variation in emissions reductions. This means that from location to location or process to process, ethanol sugarcane always significantly reduces emissions. What do important organizations around the world say about sugarcane ethanol and their impact on emission reductions? The US Environmental Protection Agency has designated ethanol from sugarcane an advanced biofuel. Status only given to biofuels that have very high reductions of greenhouse gas emissions. According to the EPA, it reduces emissions by 61%. The EPA also states that ethanol from corn feedstock reduces emissions by a mere 21%. The European directive stated that sugarcane ethanol reduces emissions by 71% compared to regular gasoline, whereas the Brazilian government, Ministry of Energy and Mines, puts that figure at up 90%. Okay. Where is all this ethanol produced? First off, sugarcane cannot grow in the Amazon forest. Climate conditions in northern Brazil are too wet for the plant to produce sucrose. 60% of the production comes from the state of São Paulo, which is located around 2,500 kilometers away from the Amazon region, shown in the map above. The table lists Brazil's current land uses. The area being used for sugarcane crops in the ethanol industry is just a mere 0.7% of the total area of Brazil. Finally, a trade agreement in sustainable energy must also meet the economic criterion so that developing countries can afford technologies. These countries cannot afford government subsidies, to promote clean technologies. The subsidy system cannot be exported from developed countries to developing ones. Like carbon emissions, energy cost is equally important in power development and needs to be considered in any trade agreement. The same energy technologies that you saw in a previous slide showing the emissions is now showing their energy costs over their lifetime. Since renewable costs vary widely from location to location, depending on resource availability, there's a range seen here. Large hydropower having the lowest emission on the bottom left is still seen as the renewable energy with the lowest cost. The data is from the Commission of the European Communities, and they used worldwide power plant averages. The cost of energy from a large hydropower plant in Brazil is around $50 per megawatt. It is at the lowest part of the range, cheaper than other renewables in all thermal plants. This is usually the case for large hydro projects in countries that have the hydro resources. This has been very successful in implementing large-scale renewable energy projects without the need for government subsidies. It has done so in recent years by using an energy auction system to contract out its current and future power needs. Technology-specific auctions are used to increase these other renewable sources, which are small hydropower, wind, and thermal biomass power plants, competing only with other renewable energy projects. The lowest the bid price wins the auction. This type of system promotes a competitive market and cost-effective projects without the need for subsidies. I'd like to end this part of my presentation by giving an example, the Belo Monte project. It shows how a large hydropower project could incorporate all three sustainable development pillars while reducing poverty levels. The installed capacity of this project will be over 11,000 megawatts, or 11% of Brazil's current capacity. By implementing this one project, over 19 thermal natural gas power plants will be avoided, which would have emitted 12 megatons of carbon dioxide. That is the double the emission from the entire Brazilian grid in 2007. I'll finish. To talk about sustainable energy and poverty reduction, it is also important to mention the importance of South-South cooperation among developing countries. Lessons learned within these areas should be shared, especially when it comes to infrastructure and for technology transfer. Currently, there are specific trade barriers impeding the further dissemination of Brazilian renewable energy technologies and products. I will discuss those here. This is a summary of applied tariffs on renewable energy products in key countries. It was taken from the International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development recent report. There are high tariffs in place that affect Brazil in ethanol in the US and the European Union. Why is this? That's because Brazil and other tropical countries have the right climate to grow the feedstock at very high yields. Also, the energy content in sugarcane is much higher than the feedstock that's being used in the US and the European Union. This makes ethanol from sugarcane very cost competitive. Brazilian ethanol is therefore being penalized by these countries for having the right climate to grow one of the most energy-rich feedstock in the world. But let's look at these two markets a bit further to get an idea of the impact these tariffs have on Brazilian ethanol sales. The US biofuel market is the largest in the world, both in consumption and in production. There's a US mandate to consume 139 billion liters of biofuel annually by 2022. The EPA has already mentioned has recognized Brazil's biofuel as having a high impact on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The biggest barrier to Brazil ethanol industry internationally is a 14 US cents per liter tariff put on important biofuel and an additional 11 US cents per liter subsidies to American ethanol. Combined, that puts 25 US cents per liter advantage to American ethanol, or 56% of its average export price. Domestic protectionism in the renewable energy field is impeding the widespread use of technologies that are capable of reducing carbon emission more than domestic ones, at sometimes low cost, as is this the case of biofuels in the US.
Minutes for the panel, and I wanted to make sure the final speaker has a chance to present.
Okay.
Thank you. It's harder when you're towards the end. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I think you raised a number of important points just there when we look at the issues of domestic subsidies and the distortions that they bring to these markets. So join me in thanking Mr. Calvacanci. Okay. Final speaker, thank you so much for joining us. Unfortunately, I didn't have your bio, and so I apologize. Thabo Shauki is Director of the Multilateral Organizations in the Department of Trade and Industry for the Republic of South Africa. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Amy, and good afternoon, colleagues. Correctly so, you didn't get my bio because I was not supposed to be the one to be here. My colleagues who were supposed to be here are still stuck in the negotiations. But be that as it may, it's quite interesting to listen to the speakers that came before me. I think these are messages which are quite pertinent and relevant to South Africa, as Peter has also indicated in his presentation. Let me then talk to the issue. As some of you might be aware, this symposium we are jointly convening with ICTSD, that is my Department of Trade and Industry. So I came here to listen to the speakers and also to draw some lessons from what they had to say. I think as the speakers have already indicated, I mean, from the trade perspective, there's no doubt in my mind, and also from the perspective of the department, that trade has a role to play in terms of either facilitating trade in this, either if you look at it from the perspective of environmental goods and services, or it could frustrate the facilitation of those products. So, as Peter has indicated, there are three areas that you can look at it. I mean, one is to look at it from the perspective of what is the role of tariffs insofar as facilitating trade, or you can look at also from the perspective of subsidies and non-tariff barriers. And I think the study that the ICTSD has done also ably, illustrate how these issues can have a bearing on this thing, on facilitating trade in environmental goods. There is a recent study by the World Bank which was done. In fact, it says focus on green growth, and it's a study that focuses on South Africa. Interesting enough, and I think it's also borne by it's received some support also from the finding that also Peter made in his presentation. In South Africa, tariffs really, insofar as the environmental goods are concerned, plays a limited role. On average, broadly defined, by the way, because as some of you might be quite aware, environmental goods is still a contentious issue in terms of what is the definition. But broadly defined, or using the definition that the World Bank has used, the study has indicated that South Africa, for instance, imposed about 3.6% on the so-called environmental goods. And compared to the average tariffs that we apply on merchandise goods, which is 7.8%, so you realize that environmental goods, in fact, receive or face little tariffs compared to the rest of the merchandise goods. Subsidies, not a lot of subsidies are deployed in this area, but perhaps the point that I also need to say is that in South Africa, because our industry, as some of you might have been aware, we tend to, it's quite intense in terms of using, for lack of a better word, dirty energy or fossil fuel. And the attempt by government is to win industry, or including the other players, from resorting to cleaner energy. Now, that has been done in two ways. One is to introduce a price that will reflect the social cost, and of course with some complaint from from the public in South Africa, because at the same time you also want to have a universal access, and as one of the presentation made it quite plain, you might have seen that South Africa, in terms of universal access, at least 75% of electricity has been rolled out. But now then there is an issue of how do you introduce price that will reflect social cost without undermining your universal access. But that is a trajectory that we are on now, prices, and we are also contemplating to introduce carbon tax. This is something that is still being debated. Hopefully in the near future, one will be able to report on what the progress is in that regard. But so as I indicated, tariffs, little role. The only area that I have dissent from Peter's presentation, I think, is on non-tariff barrier. I think he highlighted the issue of buy local. And the department's thinking, we have trade policy, which also helps to facilitate trade, but we also have an industrial policy, which also wants to not only just facilitate, but also to nurture the industry. So there are certain industries that have been identified with a view to grow them. There is we are in the crisis, but we also see this crisis as an opportunity to help us to make a transition to the green economy. And in doing so, industrial policy, South Africa's industrial policy has made it quite plain that we need to identify some industries that can be nurtured with a view of growing them. My hope is that we will carefully and judiciously pay attention to the fact that in our effort, as he correctly indicated, those policies do not impede access access to environmental goods, and also to make a transition to a clean energy. The other thing that which I also need to touch upon, I won't be long, is that in light of the experience integrated resource plan, I think there is what is envisaged also is to harness energy from renewables. I was very much impressed about the significant strides that countries such as India and Brazil have made in this area. Our goal is not as ambitious as Brazil. As Brazil and also as India, but we want to expand it also. And some of the modalities that I think Ricardo also has mentioned into how you get an agreement or how you are able to get access to cleaner energy. What we are, as South Africa, is that we will also use our regional trade agreements to import some of the energy, especially hydropower, from our neighboring countries, which are in the capacity to do so. And I think, Carlos, in his presentation, he also revealed how Africa, in particular Sub-Saharan Africa, has potential in terms of really generating energy from hydro. So this is an area which we are seriously contemplating, seriously considering to pursue. And also recognizing the fact that South Africa, in terms of our obligations, even in these negotiations, one of the, I think it was at the Copenhagen meeting on climate change, where South Africa made one of the pledges to reduce carbon by a figure of 34% from the business as usual trajectory by 2020. Of course, it was subject to South Africa receiving some assistance in finance, technology deployment, and technology transfer. But there is a recognition from government that we need to do something in terms of reducing carbon dioxide from at least a business as usual trajectory. So from South Africa's perspective, and also the modalities that Ricardo, painted to us as to how we can maybe get a deal either through plurilateral agreements, either within the WTO or outside it. I think in the WTO at this stage, in my reading, and that's the reading of my government, is that it will be difficult to get a deal. And I think this also the finding, or at least the assertion made also in the paper that of the ICTSD, perhaps what might be feasible it is to have a deal which is outside the WTO. I think that will be more practical, and perhaps even more practical. I mean, there's nothing really that stop countries from reducing tariffs unilaterally so in the areas of environmental goods. I don't think there's an argument that countries that think that is in their interest, they need to wait for the process in the WTO to run its full course. Like as I've indicated, in the case of South Africa, the tariffs are relatively low, but of course there is scope to do more. So as we explore different approaches in terms of how to get tariffs to be reduced in this area, really I think the best approach would be from countries to do by themselves without waiting for the process in the WTO. And the other process is exactly as Ricardo was saying in his paper, perhaps exploring the plurilaterals. But as I say, my reading, and it's an honest opinion as to what is happening in the WTO, it will stand a less chance to explore plurilateral agreements in this area in the WTO. Not because there's anything controversial about this issue, it's just the approach itself and the way the negotiations have been unfolding. I mean, the reality is that it do not fly. Perhaps outside there is a scope to do something. So in closing, I will say that South Africa, I think we read with interest some of the strides that other countries have made, and I think we can draw lessons from what other countries have done. And I think Peter's also presentation as to their intent of sharing their technology with South Africa, it's a welcome development, and I think it's something that we will encourage as we want to transit into this new green economy, which has the potential to help the country to grow employment, which is a serious challenge at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So we have just a couple of minutes, so can I take a couple of questions? I know we're over, but we started 5 minutes late, so I'm saying, okay, we get 2 more minutes. Does anyone have any questions, comments, issues? Yes.
Thank you. I'm Tom Brewer. I'm a Scholler Foundation Fellow in Germany. My question is especially for Peter Brunn, but anybody else who is interested is certainly welcome to reply. It concerns the recent U.S.-China dispute on China's wind subsidies. It was a case, of course, that was resolved after going to the WTO, but without going to a dispute panel. My question is about the wider implications, either in the wind industry or, for that matter, any other industry. is that likely to be a precedent, not just in a legal sense, but a more broadly political sense, such that countries, including yours and others in the EU, might decide to undertake similar cases, and or could it change the policies of potential target countries who might decide that they're vulnerable? Or is this just a sort of one-off case? Thank you.
Well, as a matter of fact, the panel case, U.S. against China on solar subsidies, but nevertheless, there are parallels. There's also another panel initiated, Japan versus Canada,
Right.
for local content in the provinces, at the provinces level.
Mm-hmm.
These two cases, these two panels are going to be extremely interesting in their rulings over the next month or 2012. And certainly we do hope to have some guidance from the panel on what is allowed, what is possible within the rule book of the WTO and what is not. We might actually very soon be in a situation where there's a clear ruling on these things, and then that will set up a lot of limitations on how you can move around on both subsidies, but certainly also NTBs like local content. From an industry point of view, we can only encourage that there will be a ruling as soon as possible so we can get that clarity and get going. And the EU, as a matter of fact, is also one of the parties who have joined in supporting that for many principal reasons. So I'm pretty optimistic.
I would just say that I happen to serve on the American Council on Renewable Energy and the advisory board of Vote Solar, which is an American solar energy industry organization, and there is a great diversity of opinion among the solar industry in the United States about the merits and the desirability of having brought that case. And actually a lot of companies don't support the United States in bringing that case against China because a number of the supports there are supports that they actually want to keep in place in the United States to continue to support the industry, as well as they feel that the industry, with the costs coming down so quickly, that we can phase out those supports very quickly in any event. So, and I would just say these cases just indicate more and more need for a sustainable energy trade agreement to get those rules clarified more broadly and not just have to wait for case by case to be decided. So I think we need to wrap up because our next panel is here, but thank you very much for joining us.